with a prime minister now in the intensive care unit. The fight against coronavirus has taken a dramatic turn in the United Kingdom. Hello, everyone. I'm François Picard. Welcome to another confined edition of the France 24 debate. We're pleased to be joined by Allyson, Pollock, director of Newcastle University's Centre for Excellence in Regulatory Science. Thanks for joining us.
Good afternoon. Thanks for inviting me.
We also want to welcome back to the show a columnist for the Sunday Telegraph and the Daily Telegraph, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet. How are you?
Oh, far so fine.
Okay. The France 24 debate, where you could join the conversation on the hashtag F24debate. Yeah, it has been a dramatic turn. The first announcement out of Downing Street was Boris Johnson admitted for monitoring and tests. It's gone up a level, though, since Monday. Jean-Émile Jamin has more.
This is the London hospital where the British Prime Minister has been held since Sunday evening. Boris Johnson had been self-isolating in Downing Street after testing positive for the coronavirus last month. On the advice of his doctor, he was taken in for tests and kept for observation. But on Monday evening, Downing Street announced that Johnson's symptoms had worsened and that he would have to be moved into intensive care. The statement continued, saying the Prime Minister was receiving excellent treatment, thanking NHS staff for their hard work and dedication. When the Prime Minister first arrived at St Thomas Hospital, his symptoms are said to have included a high temperature and a cough. While his condition is since said to have deteriorated, his office have said that Johnson is conscious and doesn't require ventilation at the moment, adding that his move to intensive care has been done as a precautionary measure. British Foreign Secretary Dominic Raab, first in line to deputise for the Prime Minister, moved to dispel fears about the health of the 55-year-old, as well as dismissing any changes this could have on the way forward for government.
Well, the government's business will continue, and the Prime Minister is in safe hands with a brilliant team at St Thomas's Hospital, and the focus of the government will continue to be on making sure, at the Prime Minister's direction, all the plans for making sure that we can defeat coronavirus and pull the country through this challenge will be taken forward.
While there are hundreds of thousands of cases of coronavirus worldwide, Johnson is one of the first known heads of government to have the illness.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, your reaction when you first heard the news that he'd been moved to intensive care?
Well, first of all, that it was getting more serious, and second, there was some doubt as when was he actually moved to intensive care? How long had he been in hospital? And had they been trying to sort of keep business as usual and hoping that it would get better, and finally not doing it? There was a feeling that they felt so bereft or worried about this that they were not immediately frank about it. I think now we get the information as it comes out, but I think there was a floating moment for about 48 hours when actually nobody at Downing Street knew exactly how the Prime Minister was doing.
Allyson, Pollock, the latest statements that we have at the time of recording this are that the Prime Minister is in stable condition, that he does not have pneumonia, that he's not been placed on a respiratory. Tell us a bit about what it means to be in intensive care when you have COVID-19.
Well, the Prime Minister is not in intensive care and he's not on a ventilator because he's not been anaesthetised and sedated, and he's not having support for his lung function and other organs. So I think it's really important to remember that at the moment he's having oxygen therapy and he's not having even what we can gather. And I think the important thing is to remember that for the vast majority of people, COVID is mild. Most people get better. Over 80% of people have mild symptoms which resolve quite rapidly. And then there's a small percentage who get very severe symptoms, and then that they either need supporting either with oxygen or supporting at home because their symptoms are going on for a long time, 9, 10, 11 days. And then those who need some what's known as CPAP, positive airways pressure, continuous positive airways pressure with oxygen, and then the very small percentage that need to be ventilated. And I think the other thing to remember is that for young people, they make very good recoveries. Most of the deaths are occurring, and the serious cases are occurring in older people. So in the UK, we know almost half the deaths are happening in the over 80s, and 3/4 of the deaths are happening in the over 70s. But often these people there are subgroups there who also have other conditions going on, like chronic airways disease, severe cardiac disease, autoimmune disease. So I think it's very important that people don't panic and get this into perspective. Obviously, the spotlight is on the Prime Minister, but really the spotlight ought to be on the country and the extent to which the UK is preparing and prepared for this epidemic. And I think already there are very serious concerns about the fact that we had almost a 2-month delay in taking action, that we moved to the extreme measure of social isolation, locking everybody down, without actually having done enough of some of the earlier interventions to begin with. And I think the other thing I would like to say is that this is not just a national epidemic. In every country, you have lots and lots of outbreaks that are happening at different stages. So it's very, very important to have local action teams in place, getting on top of their local epidemics, local outbreaks. So to treat this as one big national epidemic is a very, very mistaken strategy. And it's clear then that we're not learning from the extraordinary experience of the WHO, those who've been handling the epidemic in other countries, in the way in which we're administering the guidance and implementing the strategy at the moment. So we have some major problems in the UK.
Are you suggesting that the national lockdown is not the answer, and that it should be more pinpointed?
No, I'm suggesting that what happened was we knew the first cases were there on the 31st of January. We had an inordinate delay. It wasn't made what's called a notifiable disease till the 5th of March in England, which means then that we weren't actually reporting cases and monitoring them through the central laboratories and through GPs, because people did, if it's not a notifiable disease, they don't realize they have to report it nationally. And then we stopped doing all this thing called contact tracing. It's really important. As soon as you have a case, you then interview the case and you contact all the contacts, and you have to go into quarantine, because what you're trying to do is reduce the rates of transmission. What I'm saying is that the government did not do enough, put in place enough of the basic public health measures before moving to the lockdown. I'm not saying that a lockdown...
You can level that charge at almost every country in Europe, including here in France. I mean,
Yeah.
In fairness, Allyson, Pollock, we've never seen anything like this. I can stand guilty as charged of perhaps downplaying it myself.
Well, we haven't seen, we've had experiences of flu pandemics, but it's just that these things come around intermittently over long periods of time, 10, 20, 30 years, sometimes 50 years. But we know from Asia that they've had experience of dealing with really serious epidemics, and in the recent past, in the last 10 or 20 years. So we should have been acting on their advice and guidance. Now, I don't want you to mistake me. I am not saying we should not do the lockdown. Clearly, things are so serious, we have to slow the rate of transmission. But what I'm also saying is that we still don't know what percentage of the population have had the disease, and whether the lockdown will work long term, and whether the epidemic will come back, because often epidemics have a second wave and a third wave, and the second wave can be even worse. So what I am saying is we must learn from our delay and put in the parallel measures in the community, similar to those that we're doing in the acute hospital sector. So at the moment, we're expanding all our hospital capacity, but we're not doing enough in the community and in primary care and in nursing homes to make sure that we're getting all the cases and we're on top of this virus.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, in early March, Boris Johnson holds a press conference. People expect him to announce the beginning of confinement. Instead, he talks about herd immunity, and he was accused at the time of being a little cavalier about it all. Do you agree with Allyson, Pollock?
Well, something happened between. Oh, sorry, it's not to me.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet.
Several things. First of all, herd immunity is not only a policy that was adopted and then abandoned by Britain, it's the policy that I understand is still going on in Sweden and in Holland. And what's going to be the test of it, and I think we'll only know sort of much further down the line, is the idea of the herd immunity was protect the people who are at risk, older people, people with pre-existing conditions, and let people get what is, as Allyson said, generally mild attack, so that enough people get the natural immunity and that the disease doesn't spread. If we see places like we've just seen in Korea, for instance, and I understand Singapore, where they've had recurrence of new cases, that would be the beginning of a second wave, perhaps, because there was no herd immunity. It's difficult, and as a journalist, quite honestly, I mean, unlike Allyson, I'm not a specialist. I could see very fast that the reporting that there was on the behind the scenes political decisions on this in Downing Street, especially a Sunday Times, a long investigative piece, led to the second part, which was confinement. I would go with François on this one, which is that they were not quite sure, and they had specialists on both sides. You had Imperial College on one side, you had Oxford on the other, and they had two conflicting theories, which have good and bad points. I would not judge myself.
Allyson, Pollock, we're discovering in all of this, by the way, that because we don't pay that close attention to the medical community, gosh, it's just as tribal as it is with sports or politics.
Well, one of the big problems is the nature of the scientific advice, because the government used mathematical modelers and physicists, which is fair enough, and it also used behavioral scientists. But the most extraordinary thing is that they didn't actually ask for the opinions of the people who've got real expertise in epidemic control and in communicable disease control. And so some of the assumptions in the models are deeply problematic, because it's very clear that the mathematical modelers and the behavioral scientists weren't talking to the people who really knew what was going on in the ground and had a lot of operational experience. And if that had happened, you can't help feeling that the government would not have allowed this virus to let rip through the community, but it would actually have taken steps to put in the necessary measures before having to move on to the major lockdowns that we're seeing. Now, I don't know the extent to which this problem is being replicated in other countries in the West, but it has clearly been a real problem, the decimation of our public health expertise.
Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, here in France, just for a second to talk about if we could have a brief ellipse here to talk about the situation here in France. You could say we've heard a lot of that criticism here, how the National Health Authority in this country went about it. There's been a lot of second guessing. Of course, hindsight is 2020.
At this stage, hindsight is not even 2020 because we're still living through it. But the French system is pretty different from the English one. And it's more that it's incredibly top down, with the health service being, of course, state-run, and various policies having been conducted over the years that were mostly economic policies. And the one thing that caught and inflamed French opinion was the fact that there used to be a strategic reserve of masks, several billion masks, and that they were got rid of in 2013 because they were trying to cut costs in the French health system. Every health system in Western countries is facing exactly the same problems, which is medicine is more expensive because it's actually more efficient, and people are getting older precisely because medicine is better, and therefore you've got more people to cure, and it costs more. And they've all been trying to cut costs, mostly with the dead hand of consultants, rather than talk to doctors. And to be honest, on the other side, usually unions of doctors, health services, etc., all say we just need more money, and perhaps there ought to have been a different organization. Some of the rationalization that was going on did make sense at the time. people who said we're closing down hospitals and therefore getting rid of hospital beds, because when you have small maternities, for instance, in the French provinces, and they have perhaps 80 births a year, they do not have the experience to deal with the birth that could have complications, and we'd rather have people go to the hospital of the regional big town, and they will have more experience, and that will be better for everyone. And on paper, it was perfectly logical. When you needed just beds, it meant that there were fewer beds. That being said, we've started counting, again, everybody's a critic afterwards, we started counting the number of beds in France compared to, for instance, to Germany, which has a very different system. It's completely regional, and the Germans were much better equipped, and I think there's part of it was because it's a regional system, and I also think because they are Germans, they like efficiency, but that may be a caricature. But I've been through the German health system in my life as a patient, and I was so impressed by it.
Yeah, 2 to 3 times more beds. Let's talk about the politics over in the UK, Anne-Elisabeth. The Times of London saying you've got Dominic Cummings, the big political advisor to Boris Johnson. He's in self-isolation after developing symptoms. Eddie Lister, he's 70 years old. He's in the at-risk category, so hasn't been to number 10 in a few weeks' time. Lee Kane, the communications director for the Prime Minister, he's been off with symptoms. Junior aides have been in self-isolation. And that article quotes, many of the key players are simply not there at the moment, says a conservative source. It has definitely made the whole thing more tricky to get a grip on. Is there a power vacuum in the UK, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet?
I don't think there's a power vacuum in the UK yet, because there's a difference between being in self-isolation because you've had contact with people who have had coronavirus and actually having more than the symptoms, as Boris Johnson developed. For instance, Michael Gove now is self-isolating, partly because he was in contact with who else but Boris Johnson. He's still in a state where he can do exactly what we are doing right now, which is to do this with Skype or the secured equivalent of it. That's one thing. The other thing about Boris Johnson's cabinet is, having won the election last December, Boris Johnson has a cabinet that he has shaped in order to trust people. And it's the beginning. I think at one stage, the beautiful unity of practically any government starts dissolving as time goes on and the bloom is off the rose. But right now, he reshaped it so that he had a mini sort of reshuffle at one stage, so that he really had people whom he understands and trusts. At this stage, I don't think there's a power vacuum. There's a very strong chancellor who's the great surprise of this year. It's Rishi Sunak, who obviously, he had to present a budget and then change the budget because of the current crisis. And many people favoured him to sort of take over more than Dominic Raab, the foreign secretary, who's not that popular. But the decision, I think, that was taken was, let's not start, changing things. Dominic Raab has much more cabinet experience, and let's make this work. I'm not saying it's going to hold forever. I'm saying that right now, I don't think there's a power vacuum.
And if Boris Johnson is out of action for a long time, who's in charge?
That's an interesting question, because Dominic Raab is the first secretary in the order of precedence, but he is not the vice prime minister. If you remember the Cameron premiership, there was a vice prime minister who was Nick Clegg, because you had a coalition of the Lib Dems and the Tories. They will have to take a decision.
Your thoughts on right now, is the country being run?
Who's that question to?
To you, Allyson.
Oh, yeah, okay. Well, of course, the country's being run. Major decisions have been made. The question is when we start to move away from this central command and control to actually devolving decisions much more to local areas, so that they can begin to take control of their local outbreaks and do a lot more local management. And I think that's the big concern. In epidemics, you need to have a lot of local action teams doing the work on the ground. So that's going to be really important. And one of the big issues is that there doesn't seem yet to be an exit strategy. We have different departments predicting different timing for the epidemic peak. One is mid-April, another Public Health England has said mid-May. So But in the meanwhile, we should really be beginning to prepare to take much more local decisions about what can and can't happen. Because we know that in some areas of the UK, there are very, very few cases.
So is the National Health Service, Allyson, hardwired for the kind of decentralization you're talking about?
No, we're not. I mean, we've become completely centralized. And one of the big problems is that local government doesn't have the powers to take control that it used to have. And the other problem is that they've had their budgets cut by 50%. So they're utterly decimated. So what we're seeing in this response to the epidemic is that it's been largely by the fact we've cut too many beds, we haven't kept pace with need, and at the same time, we've decimated our public health laboratory services and the public health on the ground. And that's one of the reasons why our testing rates are so low, is partly because of the huge cuts we made to our public health laboratory services, which were regionally organized. And we've restructured and centralized for efficiencies, but that has meant usually cuts and closures. So what this government needs to do urgently is to rebuild the capacity, not just in the hospitals, as you were seeing, where they're putting up makeshift hospitals and buying ventilators. They need to do that on the ground at local level and local authorities. And that is going to need an injection of cash, an injection of people and resource, because you can't build that without that. And the government's throwing money at the problem everywhere, but it's not throwing money at the solutions, and that's what it needs to do next. It needs to work out a really proper strategy, and we haven't heard that yet.
All right, it's been a time of unprecedented crisis in the UK, in Europe, in the West, as well as in Asia, and now in Africa as well, and in Latin America. Anne-Elisabeth Moutet, there was this moment before that announcement that Boris Johnson was being admitted to hospital for testing over the weekend, when suddenly you had the sense that leadership was back in the UK, what with the election of an opposition leader. Jeremy Corbyn had been a lame duck, and the fact that you have the Conservatives with a solid majority. Are we back to having a leadership crisis? I asked that question again.
Well, let's pray that the Prime Minister sort of recovers, and he recovers in good shape. But if he's not intubated, it will be a matter of weeks. If he has to be intubated, which I really sort of wish he won't, because you don't wish this on anyone, then that might take months. And everybody in Britain remembers the mess that the Tory party was during the whole ordeal of Brexit, which is now far from our minds. And they remember the 3 years of undecisiveness under Theresa May, and that would create a crisis. But I also think that the Tories now know what it feels like to have an electoral victory. They still have the seats, so they don't need to have a snap election. It can last for a bit, and they also have the sense of emergency. I'd like to bring in, and that was my column this morning for the Telegraph, the role of the Queen in this. The Queen's address was something absolutely extraordinary, and I'm saying this because I saw it from France, where I live. And the number of French people, even people on the left, even journalists who are sort of very cynical about these things, who were full of admiration for this lesson in unity, in national unity and memory and sort of purpose and resourcefulness, was something.
Yeah, everybody here stood up. You're definitely right, and took notice. It's only been a handful of times that outside of her annual Christmas address that the Queen of England has taken to the airwaves. Let's take a listen.
I hope in the years to come, everyone will be able to take pride in how they responded to this challenge. And those who come after us will say the Britons of this generation were as strong as any, that the attributes of self-discipline, of quiet, good-humoured resolve, and of fellow feeling still characterize this country. The pride in who we are is not a part of our past. It defines our present and our future.
More than just a figurehead monarch in that instance, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet?
Well, it depends how you define figurehead. she is the head of state. She's not the head of government, but she's got almost 80 years of experience of, having lived through the war, having actually volunteered through the war, having been, she's 93 years old. She's soon going to be 94. And she has this great wisdom of someone who's seen 15 prime ministers come and go. And every Tuesday, and until last week, she was talking to Boris Johnson on the telephone, but every Tuesday, the prime minister has a meeting with a monarch. And so she's got the kind of experience that started with briefings from Winston Churchill and has gone on to this day. And there is this great sort of symbolic charge as well as political wisdom and the sense of continuity. And I think at a moment when you don't really have an enemy, this is not what President Macron said. It's not a war. It is something that is attacking the country, but it's not an enemy. It's a thing. And she struck exactly the right note when our politicians hadn't been so good about it. And I think that just as I already believed that at the time of Brexit, the fact that she was there was the only bulwark against complete a sort of division of the country, I think here it shows that having a storied monarchy that's more than 1,000 years old helps.
Allyson, Pollock, your reaction to the Queen's speech?
Well, I don't really know what to say. I mean, people... everybody is doing what they're being told to do on the whole. And I think the real disappointment is in our politicians. And I think there's going to have to be a really very major public inquiry into why, when we had so much warning, we got it so wrong and we waited so long before resorting to the extreme measure of a lockdown. And I think that public inquiry will have to look back over the last 2 or 3 decades to see the way in which we've ripped out the support for epidemics. We've known for a long time, epidemics come in cycles. Our institutional memory should not be so short. Every 10 years, every 20 years, you're going to get a major one. We were not prepared. There is going to have to be a major reckoning after this, both for the lack of preparedness and also for the delay in tackling it, and also ongoing now, whether we actually have a strategy. And I think these are really big questions, and the public deserve to know. Every push to the public, they're supposed to take responsibility for their actions. The government has imposed these extraordinary draconian measures, which also undermine our civil liberties. The legislation has taken away our civil liberties. And so I think this is a really serious moment, and we do not want to be moving into a police state. And this is why we need to have the exit strategy, and we need to have a proper plan for the economy, for employment, as well as for public health going forward.
The fact that there is a new leader of the opposition, Allyson, Pollock, does that make it easier for the country to come together to draw up that exit plan?
Well, one would hope so, but the role of the leader of the opposition is to ask the difficult questions. And my big worry about a government of national unity, which is what is being talked about, is that we won't have an opposition which is effectively asking the difficult questions. And that was as important in the Second World War as it is today. You have to keep asking about what the strategy is. Why aren't they doing this? Where are the data for that? At the moment, the government is releasing very little data, and it's been holding on to that very tightly. We need much, and we need to take the public, they need to take the public with them. So if the opposition is going to be effective, it needs to ask the difficult questions and to keep asking them, and to remind government that we can't remove our civil liberties and our human rights indefinitely, because this is exactly what's happening. And it's pretty miserable for many millions of people. Not only are they dealing with poverty, but our older people are dealing with extraordinary isolation and lack of care. And that's happening in our nursing homes, where we have 500,000 people now who have no contact with relatives, no contacts with care staff, and are getting their meal really 3 times a day. And it's a miserable existence for them. And there are many millions of people who are suffering. And my concern is that we must not make the measures worse than the actual virus itself, because there can be many unintended consequences for this, for the poor and the most vulnerable in society. And that's the role I would say, of the opposition.
Do you agree, Anne-Elisabeth Moutet?
I think yes, especially since there's such a thing as a loyal opposition that still is asking the right questions. So it shouldn't be, my hopes are not that high on being able to trust politicians either in my country or in Britain to be responsible. But I think there will be some among them who will be responsible. And I think just as in Britain, in France, we have lots of hard questions to ask about how hospitals have been organized or disorganized, how some people sounded the alarm a month ago and said, look, we might have problems with a pandemic because they looked at SARS and they were not listened to. The French have something very specific, which is that the hierarchy is so inflexible that right now there is this treatment that's been advocated by a French professor in southern France, Professor Raoult, on hydrochloroquine that was quoted by Donald Trump, who knows nothing about it, good or bad. But it hasn't yet had the proper studies, but the studies could have been sped up, and a number of decisions at every level could have been sped up, and they were not sped up because the bureaucracy was inflexible. There's the fact that veterinary testing laboratories, which deal for farms with mass testing that could be adapted, and they had the resources to adapt it to testing of humans, were not approved by the hierarchy in the French health ministry, and therefore were not allowed to go and create the stream of testing that could have been used on human beings. And that is something that really has to be examined by a parliamentary committee, I think, with very hard-nosed afterwards. How is it that the system does not function because people do not want to take responsibilities or decisions, or have the not invented here, not decided by my direct boss attitude that essentially loses lives?
Before we end this conversation, I'm going to ask each of you, I'll start with you, Anne-Elisabeth, about how you've experienced confinement personally and what it's taught you.
It's taught me a great deal of humility because I live alone in a nice place and with a company of 2 cats. And so in the center of Paris, and the shops have what I need. And so this is people who are 4 people in a small apartment do not have it as good as I have. I'm extremely privileged in this respect. And still, there was a huge difference between spending a week, 2 weeks at home because I was writing a book, and being at home and not being able to go out and having to minute the time when I went out shopping and having to get home, get rid of my clothes, clean every single item that was getting into the flat with vinegar or alcohol, wash my hands all the time. And it's been a weight that I did not expect. And I think it's taught me humility. Human beings are more resourceful in groups, and being separated is actually much more difficult to support, to stand, than I thought it would be.
Allyson, what's it been like in the Pollock household in Newcastle?
Well, it's in Edinburgh, actually.
Edinburgh, excuse me, sorry.
It's been fine, apart from we have 1 case of COVID, a GP who's unwell for the 10th day, and in isolation while we're in quarantine. But actually, otherwise, it's thank goodness for social media and the internet. Academics and like journalists, we're very lucky. We're used to interacting on the phone and by social media. But it's the millions of people out there, as Elisabeth says, who do not have the resources that we do, who are really suffering, either because they're worried because they have no job or no food, or they're worried about how they pay their rent or their income, or they're subject to domestic abuse. And children having to go without education is awful. All children have a right to education. So suspending education in schools is really dreadful. And that must be one of the priorities for the government, is to get our children back to school. Even if we don't go back to work yet, our children must be enabled to go back to school. And that means implementing local actions to really understand where this outbreak is occurring in different parts of the country. And that's what happened.
Forgive me for prying, but your colleague who's in isolation within the house, can you explain to us how it works?
So what happens is that person is completely isolated. We're fortunate in that we have another bathroom. It would be awful if you didn't have another bathroom. And meals are taken and delivered to the door and returned, and you wash and clean the vessels, and you have conversations through the doorway, and that's how it actually works in isolation. But of course, not all families have enough space to be able to do that, and so there is quite a lot of mixing between the contacts and the isolated. And of course, you're into a 14-day period where, really strictly speaking, you are in quarantine and the contacts are in quarantine, apart from absolute essentials.
All right, and is there a comfort that you've found, Allyson? Is there something that that you've discovered through this process?
I think I'm pretty resourceful and resilient. I think the nicest thing is having social media and the internet. The day my internet went down for one day and I was devastated, that was the discomfort. 20 years ago, it wouldn't have mattered not having an internet. It shows you how reliant we are on social media and WhatsApp. We're social creatures, so we try and find ways of communicating. I think that's what's so extraordinary, is all the time you're reaching out to me, I'm reaching out to you, we're finding ways of communicating. And that's the amazing comfort. And that's why I'm so devastated for the millions of people in nursing homes that do not have that ability to have that comfort at the moment. And I think they're the people we should be thinking about, the really vulnerable people who don't have the access and the resources that we have.
All right, and we are indeed thinking about them. Allyson, Pollock, thank you for joining us from Edinburgh. I want to thank Anne-Elisabeth Moutet for being with us from the French capital. Thank you for being with us here in this confined edition of the France 24 debate. There's much more on COVID-19 on our website, france24.com.